Edward was sitting at his desk, examining an accounting report. His head was full of negative thoughts. Why did I buy this restaurant? I've had a successful, reliable supermarket business for years, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted something new. Well, here's my reward for being stupid. Now I have to examine a financial report with clear signs of unprofitability and figure out what to do about it. The task wasn't easy. He purchased the restaurant recently. The staff was unfamiliar, and the nuances of running such a business were also unfamiliar. And the cherry on the cake was the video from the cameras brought by the head of security, where the cleaning lady was taking home a heavy bag from the restaurant kitchen. Of course, the problems in the business weren't just because of the cleaning lady, and most likely she's really just stealing leftovers from the restaurant. His father always criticized him for being too romantic and somewhat impractical, and now it was crystal clear that the idea of buying a restaurant was the most foolish and impractical. It was beautiful and exquisite, but not profitable at all. No, he shouldn't tell his father about his problems. In such cases, he always gets nervous and says, "You have your mother's temper." Edward never really fully understood what his father meant by saying this because his memories of his mother, who disappeared when he was about 5 years old, were vague. It was not her facial features or events, but just a sense of something beautiful, elusive, and radiant, which always made the world around him bright, kind, and not scary. Without her, that sense was gone, and 25-year-old Edward didn't want to confess even to himself that he was always trying to recreate that beautiful image in his life and that he was suffering from the inability to find his past in his present. Childish pain sometimes resurrected the lost hope of meeting his mother. However, what meeting did he even think about? His father tried to find her. He even involved the police, but to no avail. No, he shouldn't bother his father with the restaurant problems. He had to find a way out on his own. Suddenly, Edward thought, why don't I try talking to the cleaning lady secretly, not as the restaurant owner, but pretending to be someone else, especially since the staff hardly knows me yet. A plan was emerging in his head: old clothes, messy hair, fake bruises under his eyes, and a confusing look. Now Edward was looking in the mirror and saw a homeless guy with no job and no money, so the first visit would be to the cleaning lady. Her shabby house was on the very outskirts of the city, among similar poor houses. Yeah, creepy slums, Edward thought. Okay, it's time to find out whether the people living here are kind. The owner of the house was at home. At a timid knock on the window and a request for some food and water, she invited him in. It turned out to be a cheerful place for children, 2 of whom were twins, making a tent out of old blankets. All these children are yours? Edward couldn't hide his surprise. 2 are mine, and the twins are my late husband's children, so they are mine too. But how do you provide for them alone? Clothes, toys, food? Well, kind people give us clothes and toys. There's actually a lot of good people, believe me. And about the food, I work as a cleaner in a restaurant. The food there is delicious and high quality, and the guests often don't finish, so I take the leftovers home. It might be disgusting to some people, but I have no choice. At least the boys have enough to eat every day. Thus, a leisurely conversation began. Edward quickly learned that the cleaning lady was given only leftovers, and the manager and the chef were deliberately ordering more fresh groceries than they needed and stealing the rest of it. Edward also learned a lot of other facts about his employee, about her difficult childhood in the orphanage, her short-term marriage, the terrible time of her husband's fatal illness, and her depression after he died. Edward liked this woman more and more. She was still very young, but she had already been through a lot and suffered a lot, and now she was obediently bearing her life's burden, raising 4 children. I should increase her salary, he thought and said aloud. By the way, we've been talking for a while now. I know a lot about you, but I still don't know your name. Amber, a skinny woman, stretched her arm across the table. A delicate bracelet in the shape of ants chasing each other glittered on her wrist. Edward's eyes darkened. It's impossible. The pain lurking in the darkest corners of his memory was back again. Mom, she had the exact same bracelet. He liked to play with the shiny bugs on this bracelet. He remembered the bracelet even better than he remembered his mom. What's wrong? Are you okay? Amber's concerned voice came from outside. Yes, I'm fine. Where did you get such an unusual bracelet? I've never seen anything like this before. Honestly, I don't know, she smiled. I've always had this bracelet. I guess my mom gave it to me before she left me at the orphanage. I suppose it's very cheap, but still, I love this bracelet, and I've been wearing it since I was a kid. Maybe my mom was wearing it too. That's the only memory I have of her. Edward felt like his head was going to explode. Could they have the same mother? Could she be alive? Was it possible she had just left the house years ago, abandoning her son and husband? Edward had to leave immediately, calm down, and think it over. Would you like a slice of pie? Amber asked. Yes, sure, thanks. A hairbrush. There's a hairbrush on the nightstand with blonde hair on it, right? He can do a DNA test while Amber, poor Edward, sneakily took her hairbrush. The next week was hectic, supervising staff, comparing purchases and grocery consumption, dealing with orders from dissatisfied customers, and so on. Edward was doing it all while anxiously awaiting the DNA test results. On Friday, it was already clear that Amber, who was the first person he suspected of stealing, was actually the only one who wasn't stealing anything. That same day, he received the long-awaited envelope with the test results. Edward hesitated to open it. Whatever the result was, it would cause a new chain of problems and investigations. Finally, cursing himself for his cowardice, Edward opened the envelope. The result was unambiguous. He and Amber were not blood relatives. On the one hand, he felt relieved, but on the other, he had to find more information. That is, find Amber's mother and find out where she'd gotten the bracelet. Fortunately, many people in his circle used the services of private investigators, so it is quite possible to find a suitable one. Edward immediately requested Amber's personal file with her biography and photo from the HR department. On Monday, a skinny young man was already examining her file in Edward's office, trying to extract the maximum information from the minimum data. The task is clear. It won't take long. It's all within our region. The events didn't happen too long ago, and the records and witnesses should still be available. Go ahead, here's an advance payment, and I will pay you the rest when the job is done. The investigator left. For some reason, Edward desperately wanted to go to that shabby house on the outskirts of the city, convincing himself that he was only going to Amber's house to confirm his assumptions about the restaurant machinations. The fake bum pulled out a bag of old clothes. The old house turned out to be as warm and welcoming as before. It seemed that they were even waiting for Edward there. The boys ran to greet him like he was an old friend, admiringly showing the green and gray lizards in the big jar. Amber smiled and served tea and cookies for their guest. However, the woman's smile couldn't hide her sadness. Any trouble? The guest asked. Nothing serious. It's just that I take a lot of things too personally, Amber said nervously, struggling to hold back tears. I know that. Edward finally looked at his visitor. Amber fell silent and looked intensely into the owner's face. Are you okay? Edward asked politely. Yeah, sorry, you remind me of someone. If I didn't know who he was, I think you were close relatives. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I think I came here in vain. I'm sorry for wasting your time. Why in vain? I've examined the personal files of all the employees. Your personal file says you have an accounting degree, correct? Yes, but I don't have much experience. Amber muttered, you will have a chance to gain experience. What do you think of the position of accountant? The head accountant is my good friend. There's no reason for him to set you up or something. If you have no objections, you can start tomorrow. I think you'll be happy with the salary. I hope I can count on your honesty. You're doing the right thing when you listen to your good friends." Without giving the dumbfounded Amber a moment to come to her senses, he pushed the button on the phone and said, "Next." The investigator turned out to be next. "Here we go," he thought. The investigator sat down in a leather chair and pulled a stack of papers out of a black folder. "I've got some news." Luckily, everything was official. It wasn't easy to find out her current address and name, but nevertheless, I succeeded. Her photos and other material are here as well. The young man put the folder on the mahogany table. Edward had no idea how he would behave if Amber came to his office tomorrow or met him at the restaurant. He didn't want to admit that the heart-to-heart conversations over tea had become so dear to him. "I never realized there were situations where bums got more warmth and sincerity than entrepreneurs," a philosophical thought flashed through his mind. Would they be able to keep the trust that had developed between them so suddenly and unpredictably? Edward really wanted that. The asphalt of the highway was smoothly lying under the wheels of the car. Pine trees flashed along the road, seeming golden in the early morning sun. The road was the best place for reflection. Half-forgotten images of his childhood flashed through his mind, replaced now and then by Amber's bewildered, puzzled eyes full of questions. No, he has to do something. He'd heard from his mother for the first time in 20 years. The clue was indirect. It didn't prove or explain anything, but it gave Edward hope. He has to remember everything he can. He shouldn't expect any help from his father. There was a blank wall when he tried to talk about his mom, not a single word. But in the evening, there was a fireplace and an open bottle again. For some reason, Dad never said anything about the circumstances of Mom's disappearance. Maybe he knows something but doesn't want to mention it. Although it's been 20 years, if he knows something, it's time to tell the truth. After all, Edward is not a child anymore. With these painful reflections, Edward reached a small settlement. Small houses huddled together, covered from prying eyes by bushes of lilacs and jasmine. After wandering around for a while, Edward found the right house, which was different from its neighbors because of its dilapidated fence. Edward knocked, and the woman from that photo opened the door. Her face was still young. She had smooth, neat hair, and a longing in her eyes mixed with caution. Edward said, "Hello, Anna." "Yes, who are you, Anna?" "I really need your help in a case involving my family." "Will you allow me to ask you a little about your life?" "Sure, why not?" "I didn't have a lot of joy in my life, but I didn't have much to hide either. I've lived here most of my life. Everyone knows everything about me anyway." The house was clean, with old furniture in the corners. Edward brought a large box of sweets, and Anna immediately opened it, put it on the table, and said, "Who did you want to ask about?" "Your daughter and the bracelet you gave her." The woman stood up abruptly, walked to the window, and after a pause, asked nervously, "Who are you to her?" Edward had to tell the truth about who he was, how he met Amber, and how he found out about the bracelet. "Yeah, rich people can have a tough life too." "Okay, dear, you told me about my daughter. Thank you for that. I'll tell you everything I know. I had a good start in life. I was an excellent student. I got married successfully. We were so happy, especially when we found out we were expecting a baby. Except, I had a difficult pregnancy. I gave birth prematurely. The girl was born very weak. The doctors didn't even let me look at her. They said I had to wait. I was lying there crying. That day, your mom was brought to the same ward. She was sick and couldn't deliver the baby. The surgery was very complicated. Doctors miraculously managed to save her, but the baby didn't survive. We stayed in the hospital for a long time and became friends. She told me about her hard life. She got pregnant not by her husband, but by her lover, a typical story. Her husband cheated on her, but she tolerated and forgave him. I think she tolerated it because of you, because she wanted to give you a better life. But as soon as she met another man, she ran out of patience. I saw her lover. He was very handsome, but usually, such guys turn out to be mean. When he found out she was sick, he left your mother. She was in despair. She was always lamenting that she left her family, left her husband. When we were discharged from the hospital, she gave my daughter her bracelet. She said it was a lucky bracelet. Edward felt a mixture of emotions as his father finished the cup of tea and left his business card just in case. His mind was full of unhappy thoughts. Was he too late, and his mother really gone? It couldn't be. His brain refused to believe it. His heart refused to accept it. After all, no one had ever seen his mom dead. The investigator did a good job, but now he has a more challenging task. Edward stopped the car on the roadside and dialed the investigator's number. The restaurant greeted its owner with an unusual silence. It was impossible to resist the temptation to open the door of the accounting department. Amber was sitting there, neat and focused, studying the numbers in the columns. Funny, Edward thought, she's trying so hard. Unnoticed, he quietly closed the door and walked toward his office, smiling. The head accountant was already waiting in the reception area. "Hey, Charlie, come on in. Any good news?" After listening to a thorough report about the recovery from the crisis, Edward suddenly asked, "What do you think of the new girl?" "Not a bad girl, not much experience, but she's trying very hard. When you finish the summary tables, send her to my office with them. I'll take a look at the end of the day." The office door opened, and Amber appeared on the doorstep, serious and trying to hide her embarrassment, with the report in her hands. She was carefully holding the papers in her hands, but tried not to look at Edward. "Give me the papers and take a seat." Edward nodded to the chair and delved into the report. He deliberately studied the pages for a long time, stealthily watching Amber's embarrassment. "How do you like your new job? Already used to the new work schedule?" "Yes, of course. I really like this job, thank you so much." "I didn't even think that," Amber said, then suddenly got silent and asked after a short pause, "Why?" "What do you mean?" Edward shouted in surprise. "Why this masquerade? This new job opening?" "Because, Amber, the owner's office is not the best place to investigate the situation within the company. Besides, in the current situation, I really need decent and responsible employees, and you meet these criteria. Now I know that I can trust you," Edward explained confidently. Amber looked confused, nodded vigorously, and walked out of the office without raising her eyes. Gradually, things were getting back on track. The fraudsters were fired, new employees were working hard, and business was gradually coming out of the crisis. But the detective remained stubbornly silent. In the rare moments of communication with Amber, they never regained their former trust. The investigator showed up out of the blue, no prior call. He looked tired, and the task had indeed been difficult. "Is she alive?" That was all Edward could say. The detective nodded affirmatively, and Edward immediately snatched the folder with the address out of his hands. He immediately ran to the car, jumping over the steps. Another old house. He'd seen too many old houses lately. The windows of the house were almost buried in the ground, and the shabby fence was covered with wild grapes. But behind the house was a large vegetable garden. He saw a woman in the yard. Edward ran straight through the garden. There she was. The woman straightened her back. Her face was covered with deep wrinkles, but through those wrinkles, familiar eyes looked at him, the eyes of his mother. Edward was sitting in her house, listening to the partially familiar story of his parents' breakup. Yes, she did drink a lot. She wanted to see her son, but his father made sure she never saw her child again. Later, a lot of things happened. She was living in shelters, trying to find a job. How did she stop drinking alcohol? She stopped when she almost froze to death in the snow one day. Edward drove the car carefully through the silent night city. His mother fell asleep in the back seat, clutching her purse with papers to her chest. But Edward was bothered by one thought: how do I tell my father about this? Nothing came to mind suddenly. As he stopped at his stoplight, a brilliant idea popped into his head: Amber, the bracelet. The next morning, Edward asked his assistant to summon the new accountant to his office. Amber walked in and saw Edward standing near the window. He turned around abruptly, and their eyes met. "Edward, since when do you introduce me to your girlfriends?" His father teased kindly. "Since today, Father," he replied calmly, trying to hide his excitement. "Be prepared to have more guests today." Edward and his father walked down the rustling gravel to the gazebo. There were two women sitting in the gazebo, one elderly and one young. The older woman was sitting in the shade, and the younger woman was pouring her a cup of coffee. "Dad, this is Amber," Edward introduced the young woman. "I'm sorry, we have a very urgent matter. We should leave for a moment. Meanwhile, please introduce yourself to the second guest." And showing extreme impoliteness and complete disregard for good manners, Edward led Amber down the path to the house. "Wow," his father muttered and stepped into the thick greenery of the gazebo. A woman was sitting there with her eyes downcast, struggling to take a sip of hot coffee from a cup. Her hand trembled, and she had to put the cup back on the table. "Is she sick?" Edward's father thought. Then all his thoughts faded away, and his heart sank down into some emptiness. A golden chain of ants hurried along the woman's skinny wrist, glistening and shimmering in the rays of sunlight. "Oh Lord, Meredith, darling," the woman's husband said faintly and sank down on the bench. The woman remained silent, still staring at the ground. Her whole posture showed extreme tension. Gregory didn't move either. He searched hard for traces of his former anger, jealousy, and wounded ego. But he could not find them. When he looked at this modest woman who neither expected nor asked for anything, he remembered not the hated cheater but his tender, loving wife from the happiest years of their marriage. For some unknown reason, no other woman had ever been able to take her place. "Meredith," Gregory repeated, stepping forward closer to his wife. "Greg," he heard a faint whisper in reply, and with that whisper, he was enveloped from head to toe by the radiant, embracing gaze of his beloved Meredith. "I'm sorry, Greg." Edward and Amber had been afraid to disturb the leisurely conversation in the gazebo for the third hour. Besides, they had a lot to talk about too. The feeling that had been carefully concealed until now found its place, and they surrendered to its smooth flow, which can be more eloquent with its silence than words, and contain more feeling in the slight stroke of the cheek than in a love letter. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.